The silence in my garage was the only comfort I had left. It was a heavy silence, thick with the smell of motor oil, old leather, and the faint, sweet scent of the sawdust I never got around to sweeping up. For the past month, ever since we lost Leo, this garage had become my sanctuary, my fortress. It was the only place I could still feel him, see him, hear his laugh echoing off the concrete walls as he'd struggled with a stubborn bolt or celebrated a perfectly tuned engine. Now, the quiet was just a reminder of the voice that was missing. My hands, usually steady from a lifetime of working with tools and machinery, trembled slightly as I held the delicate inner workings of Leo's vintage watch under my magnifying lamp. It had stopped working the day he passed. A stupid, sentimental part of me believed that if I could just get the gears to turn again, I could somehow wind back time itself. I carefully set a microscopic screw into place, my breath held tight in my chest. Leo had loved this watch. He was a genius who built a tech empire out of code and algorithms, but he had an old soul. He appreciated things that were built to last, things with history. It was the one thing he and I always shared. His wife, Chloe, never understood it. She lived in a world of disposable luxury, where the newest, shiniest thing was always best. I remember the look of polite confusion on her face when Leo had proudly shown her the 1969 Mustang we'd spent nearly a decade restoring. She'd smiled her perfect white smile and said, "It's a beautiful color, honey," as if commenting on a new throw pillow. She saw the car, but she didn't see the hundreds of hours of father-son bonding, the busted knuckles, the shared triumph. She never saw what was real. A soft click from the watch brought me back to the present. A tiny gear began to turn. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was a faint heartbeat in the crushing silence, a bittersweet victory. It was working, but time was still moving in the wrong direction. With a heavy sigh, I put my tools away. It was time. Time to trade my worn-out work shirt for the suffocating armor of a suit and tie. Time to drive downtown and sit in a sterile office to hear a lawyer read a piece of paper that would make my son's death feel official. Final. I hated it. I hated the black suit that felt like a costume, hated the polished shoes that felt like weights on my feet. I wasn't a man who belonged in a high-rise office building. I was a man who belonged here, in the quiet dignity of my garage, with the ghosts of good memories. But I had to go. It was the last thing I could do for Leo. As I walked to the door, my eyes fell on the Mustang, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Our masterpiece. Driving it today felt right. It felt like taking a part of him with me. I grabbed my keys from the hook, the weight of them feeling heavier than ever before, and stepped out into the gray Seattle morning, bracing myself for the worst day of my life. The Seattle air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of rain that was still deciding whether or not to fall. I walked down the short driveway, the polished black suit feeling stiff and alien against my skin. The Mustang sat waiting for me, its deep Highland green paint looking almost black in the overcast light. It was more than a car. It was a testament, a four-wheeled monument to a bond that death wasn't supposed to be able to break. I ran a hand over the cool metal of the driver's side door, my reflection a distorted, somber figure I barely recognized. The familiar weight of the keys in my palm was a small comfort, a connection to the thousands of ordinary days that now felt like a lifetime ago. I was just about to slide the key into the lock when a voice shattered the morning quiet. "Frank, stop." The shout was so raw and sudden it felt like a physical blow. I spun around, my heart lurching in my chest. It was my neighbor Dave, sprinting across his perfectly manicured lawn with a look of pure, unadulterated panic on his face. He was still in his plaid bathrobe and slippers, his gray hair a wild mess, and he was waving his arms like he was trying to flag down a plane. For a second, my mind just couldn't process the image. Dave was the calmest man I knew. A retired firefighter, he'd spent 30 years walking into burning buildings. I had never, in all our years as neighbors, seen him move faster than a brisk walk. "Don't, Frank, for the love of God, don't turn the key." He yelled again, his voice cracking as he reached my driveway, gasping for breath. My hand froze on the door handle. "Dave, what on earth is going on? Are you okay?" My first thought was that he was having a stroke, or maybe a heart attack. He bent over, his hands on his knees, his chest heaving. "Don't get in the car," he wheezed, looking up at me, his eyes wide with a terror that was starting to feel contagious. "Just wait. Dave, talk to me. What happened?" I took a step toward him, a dozen rational explanations cycling through my head. Had a raccoon gotten into the engine? Did he see a wire sparking? He finally straightened up, his breath still ragged. Last night, Frank. It was late, just after midnight. I got up to get a glass of water and looked out the window. There was a car parked down the street, a white SUV, Chloe's car. My blood went cold. I thought it was odd, that she wouldn't just pull into your driveway. Then I saw her. I'm sure it was her, Frank. She was here, in your driveway, by the Mustang. I stared at him, then glanced at the car, then back at him. The story made no sense. Chloe was here, at midnight. What would she be doing here? That's what I thought, Dave said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent tone. The hood was up. She had a small flashlight, and she was leaning into the engine bay. She was in there for a good 10, maybe 15 minutes, working on something. I almost went outside, thought maybe you were having car trouble, but then my bedroom light flicked on, the motion sensor. She must have seen it. She slammed the hood shut so fast, Frank. Didn't even look around. She just turned and practically ran back to her car and took off. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The image he painted was impossible, nonsensical. Chloe knew nothing about cars. She couldn't tell a spark plug from a dipstick. And yet, why the stealth? Why park down the street? Why run when a light came on? Dave grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Frank, listen to me. I've spent my entire life showing up to scenes where something went wrong. Bad wiring, a gas leak, a faulty valve. My gut is screaming right now. That wasn't a woman checking her father-in-law's oil. It was something else. Please, Frank, I'm begging you, don't start this car. I stood there, frozen, the keys still clutched in my hand. The quiet morning, my private grief. The simple act of driving to a painful appointment, it had all been ripped away. In its place was a terrifying, jagged question mark. I looked from my friend's panicked face to the beautiful, menacing machine in front of me. The Mustang, our masterpiece, suddenly looked like a stranger, a predator hiding in plain sight. And for the first time that day, the dread I felt had nothing to do with the will reading. My mind, which had been a fog of grief just moments before, was suddenly sharp. The world snapped into focus with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. I turned to Dave, whose face was still pale with worry, and put a steady hand on his shoulder. Go back inside, Dave, I said, my voice calmer than I felt. Get some coffee. I'll handle this. Thank you. You have no idea what you may have just done. He hesitated, his eyes still fixed on the Mustang, but he saw the shift in my expression. He saw the mechanic take over. He nodded grimly and walked back across his lawn, his slippers shuffling on the damp concrete. I was alone with the car. I took a deep breath, the cool, moist air doing nothing to quell the fire starting in my gut. I walked toward the front of the Mustang not as its owner, but as its diagnostician. I was no longer looking at our project. I was looking at a machine that had been violated, a potential weapon. My fingers found the familiar latch beneath the grille and pulled. The hood popped open with a dull thud that echoed in the quiet morning. I lifted the heavy sheet of metal, the hinges groaning softly, and propped it open. The engine bay was a work of art. Every hose, every wire, every belt was exactly as Leo and I had left it. The chrome valve covers gleamed, and the engine block was so clean you could eat off it. We had poured our souls into this engine, and its pristine condition was a source of immense pride. But today, I wasn't looking for what was right. I was looking for what was wrong. My eyes began a systematic sweep, the way I'd trained myself over 50 years of working on engines. Left to right, top to bottom. I didn't touch a thing. This was a crime scene now, and my fingerprints were already all over it. My gaze passed over the battery, the radiator, the alternator. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. Then, I caught it. A smell. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the normal garage scents of gasoline and oil, but it was there. A sharp chemical tang, like brake cleaner or some other kind of solvent. It seemed to be coming from the area around the master cylinder, where the brake fluid reservoir Saturday. My eyes narrowed. There was no reason for that smell to be there. We hadn't used any solvents on that part of the engine in months. I let my eyes drift downward, following the path of the brake lines, as they snaked their way toward the undercarriage. And that's when I saw the second thing. On the black rubber hose just below the cylinder, there was a single, tiny, glistening drop of clear fluid. It wasn't brake fluid, which has a distinct yellowish tint. It wasn't oil. It was something else, something alien. My heart was hammering against my ribs now, a frantic, wild drumbeat. My scan became more intense, more focused. I looked at the fuel line connection to the carburetor. The brass fitting was spotless, almost unnaturally so. It looked like it had been wiped down recently, while the fittings around it had a light, uniform layer of dust. My eyes traced the path of the wiring harnesses, looking for any nicks or cuts. I saw a small, fresh scratch on the firewall behind the engine block, a tiny sliver of silver metal in a sea of green paint, as if a tool had slipped in an unsteady hand. Each anomaly, by itself, was nothing. A weird smell, a strange drop of fluid, a clean fitting, a tiny scratch. An amateur would never have noticed them. But to my expert eye, they were screaming. They were puzzle pieces, and they were forming a picture of such profound malice that my mind struggled to accept it. The grief for my son was still there, a massive, gaping wound in my soul. But now, another emotion was pouring in to fill the void. A cold, hard, analytical rage. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was precise, deliberate. My daughter-in-law, Chloe, hovering over this engine in the dead of night. The pieces were connecting with the force of a physical impact. I pulled my phone from my suit pocket, my hand perfectly steady now. I scrolled through my contacts and found the number for the only person I trusted as much as myself to understand an engine. I pressed the call button. It rang twice. Marco's Auto, what's the problem? Marco, it's Frank Miller, I said, my voice low and even. I need you at my house, now. There was a pause. Marco knew me. He knew I would never call him for a simple breakdown. What's going on, Frank? You sound... Just get here, I interrupted, my gaze fixed on the violated engine. I think my car's been tampered with. And Marco, not by amateurs. Up. I ended the call and gently lowered the hood of the Mustang, the latch clicking into place with a sound of chilling finality. I turned my back on the car, the suit no longer feeling like a costume. Dave had been right. It felt like armor. My son's memory wasn't just something to be mourned with quiet dignity anymore. It was something that had to be defended. A war had just been declared in my driveway, and I had every intention of winning it. I didn't have to wait long. Less than 15 minutes after I'd hung up the phone, the familiar rumble of Marco's flatbed tow truck echoed down my quiet street. Marco was a good kid, sharp as a tack, and one of the few mechanics I'd ever trusted to work on my own projects. He was a new school technician with an old school respect for the craft. He hopped out of the cab, his brow already furrowed with concern. He took one look at my face, then at the suit I was wearing, and his expression hardened. He knew this was something serious. I gave him the rundown quick, concise, and stripped of emotion. I told him about Dave's frantic warning, Chloe's late-night visit, and the subtle, unnerving clues I'd found under the hood. He listened without interrupting, his eyes flicking from me to the Mustang, his mind already working. "We're not starting it, and we're not driving it," he said, his voice all business. "Let's get it in the garage. Your lift is working?" I nodded. Together, we pushed the heavy car up the slight incline of my driveway. The effort felt surreal, like we were pallbearers moving a beautiful, ornate coffin. Once inside, I centered the Mustang over the hydraulic lift I'd installed years ago. Marco grabbed a high-powered LED flashlight from his truck as I hit the switch, and the car rose slowly and silently into the air, revealing its underbelly. The clean, rust-free undercarriage was another point of pride, another testament to the thousands of hours Leo and I had spent. Now, it felt like we were putting a patient on an operating table to find a sickness hidden deep inside. Marco rolled underneath on a creeper, his light cutting a sharp, white beam in the dim garage. For a long minute, the only sound was the soft whir of the creeper's wheels on the concrete. I stood by, my arms crossed, watching and waiting. Then, the rolling stopped. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Marco's voice, muffled from under the car, was laced with a mixture of awe and disgust. "Frank, you need to see this." I grabbed a second flashlight and crouched down to look where his light was aimed. He was focused on the driver's side front brake line, a thin metal tube that carried the lifeblood of the car's stopping power. He pointed with the tip of a screwdriver, careful not to touch anything. "Look there. See that thin black line? That's not a crack." "Oh," I squinted, my experienced eyes picking up the detail immediately. It was a perfectly straight, hairline score, running halfway around the circumference of the brake line. It was so fine, so precise, that it looked like a manufacturing defect. But it wasn't. "That's a carbide blade score," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Marco nodded grimly. Exactly. They didn't cut it. Cutting it would be stupid, amateur. The pedal would go to the floor the first time you touched it. No, this is professional. Evil genius level. He moved the light to trace the line. This score creates a critical weak point. It'll hold just fine under the low pressure of braking around your neighborhood. But the second you get on the highway and have to brake hard from 60 or 70 miles an hour, the pressure will spike. The line will burst right here. You'd lose all hydraulic pressure instantly. No brakes, none. My blood ran cold. It was a delayed action death sentence. A perfectly engineered accident. I would have made it miles from home before the trap was sprung, making it look like a tragic, random mechanical failure. Chloe. The thought of her smiling face at the funeral, her hand on my arm, her feigned grief, it was all a lie, covering a darkness so profound I could barely comprehend it. And there's more, Marco said, his voice tight with anger. He rolled the creeper back toward the rear axle. I saw something on the frame when I was rolling in. He aimed his light at a section of the chassis, tucked away behind the gas tank. There, clinging to the metal like a deadly parasite, was a small black plastic box, no bigger than a deck of cards. It was held in place by a powerful magnet. That's a GPS tracker, Frank, Marco said, his voice barely a whisper. The expensive kind. Real-time, satellite-linked. The final piece clicked into place with sickening finality. She wasn't just trying to kill me. She wanted to watch. She would have known the moment I left the house. She would have tracked my progress, waiting for me to get on the I-5. She would have known the exact moment and location of my death. Marco slowly rolled out from under the car and stood up, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He looked at me, his face pale. Frank, this isn't just sabotage. This is a meticulously planned hit. They left nothing to chance. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking slightly with rage, and switched on the camera. We need to document every millimeter of this. We need photos. We need the police. This is attempted murder. I just stood there, staring up at the underbelly of the car my son and I had poured our love into, now understanding that it had been twisted into the anatomy of my own murder. The acrid smell of ozone from Marco's camera flash filled the garage, each pop of light a punctuation mark in the horror story laid out beneath the Mustang. He worked with a grim, methodical efficiency, capturing every angle of the scored brake lines, every detail of the GPS tracker clinging to the frame. My own mind was a storm of ice and fire. The shock had passed, leaving behind a glacial calm, a chilling sense of purpose. I was no longer a mourner heading to a sad formality. I was a soldier heading into battle. Secure everything, Marco, I said, my voice steady. Lock up the garage. Don't let anyone near it. You are now the primary witness to a crime scene. He looked up from his phone, his young face set with a gravity beyond his years. What are you going to do, Frank? He asked. I've already called a taxi, I said, pulling the cuffs of my suit jacket straight. I have an appointment to keep. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. Chloe expected me to be dead in a ditch on the side of the interstate. The single greatest weapon I had now was my own heartbeat. My survival was the one thing she hadn't planned for, and I was going to deliver that failure to her in person. The taxi ride downtown was a blur of rain-streaked windows and the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers. The city outside seemed distant, a world of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, completely oblivious to the fact that I was a dead man driving. The driver was silent, for which I was grateful. I needed the quiet to think, to let the pieces of this nightmare rearrange themselves in my head. We were approaching an intersection, and the light turned yellow. The driver tapped the brakes, and the car slowed with a gentle, predictable lurch. It was such a normal, everyday feeling, the slight forward press into the seatbelt, the quiet squeak of the brake pads. And it was that simple, ordinary act that broke the dam in my memory. Suddenly, I wasn't in the back of a taxi. I was in Leo's study, 2 weeks before he died. The room was filled with the scent of old books and the faint medicinal smell that had started to cling to him. He was sitting in his large leather armchair, a heavy blanket pooled around his thin frame. He'd lost so much weight, but his eyes, the same deep brown as mine, were still bright, still sharp. He was trying to explain the details of a new corporate partnership his company was negotiating. Chloe thinks we should be more aggressive with the terms, he'd said, his voice a little raspy. She wants to push for a higher equity stake, threatened to walk away. I remember nodding, offering some generic fatherly advice about not letting ambition cloud his judgment. He'd given me a strange, tired smile. "It's not my ambition I'm worried about, Dad," he'd said, his gaze drifting toward the window. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain outside, and then he looked back at me, his eyes holding a depth of weariness I had never seen before. "Just be careful with Chloe's ambition," he'd whispered, his voice barely audible. "It has no brakes." At the time, I'd brushed it off. I thought he was just talking about business, about the stress of the deal mixed with the fog of his illness. I thought it was a strange metaphor, nothing more. I told him he needed to rest, that Chloe was just trying to look out for him. He just shook his head slowly and let the subject drop. Now, sitting in the back of this taxi, his words came crashing back into my mind with the force of a physical impact. It has no brakes. A chill, colder and deeper than anything I had ever felt, spread through my entire body. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a warning. My son, in his final days, had tried to tell me. He saw something in her, a ruthless, runaway drive that worried him to his core, and I hadn't listened. I had failed to see what his brilliant, analytical mind had already figured out. The guilt was a sharp, stabbing pain, but the suspicion it birthed was even sharper. My focus, which had been fixed on the sabotage of my car, suddenly widened. The official cause of Leo's death was aggressive, fast-moving gastrointestinal cancer. It had come out of nowhere and had torn through his healthy 40-year-old body in less than 2 months. The doctors had called it a tragic medical anomaly. But what if it wasn't? What if his death was just as meticulously engineered as the trap that had been set for me? An ambition with no brakes wouldn't stop at trying to eliminate a father-in-law for a $40 million inheritance. It would start with the husband, who was the source of that fortune. The taxi slowed, pulling up in front of a colossal tower of glass and steel that clawed at the gray Seattle sky. Reynolds, Mitchell, and Associates. This wasn't just a law firm. It was the heart of the enemy's territory. As I paid the driver, my hand was rock steady. My mission had changed. I wasn't just here to confront the woman who tried to kill me. I was here to face the woman who I now suspected had murdered my son. Leo's final warning wasn't a memory anymore. It was a map, and I was determined to follow it to its dark, horrific end. The elevator ride to the 52nd floor was silent and swift, a smooth, sterile ascent into the heart of a world I didn't belong to. When the doors opened, I stepped out into a reception area so opulent it felt like a movie set. The floors were polished white marble, the walls were covered in abstract art that probably cost more than my house, and an entire wall of floor-to-ceiling glass offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of Puget Sound and the city below. It was a place built to communicate power, wealth, and the kind of untouchable success that Leo had earned, and Chloe had only ever worn as an accessory. And there she was. She wasn't standing by the window, gazing out pensively. She wasn't dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She was sitting in a sleek, uncomfortable-looking leather armchair, casually flipping through a glossy magazine, the picture of detached elegance. She wore a black dress that was simple, impeccably tailored, and screamed money. Her blonde hair was styled in soft, perfect waves, and her makeup was flawless. She looked less like a grieving widow and more like an actress waiting in the wings for her cue to go on stage. The sight of her, so calm and composed, sent a wave of white-hot rage through me, but I forced it down, packing it into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I walked toward her, my dress shoes making no sound on the plush area rug. "Chloe." She looked up from her magazine, and for 1/10 of a second, the mask slipped. I saw it. It wasn't surprise. It was pure, undiluted shock, a lightning flash of disbelief and horror in her eyes. Her mouth parted slightly, and the color drained from her face. It was the look of a predator who turns a corner and comes face to face with the ghost of the prey it just killed. Then, just as quickly, the mask slammed back into place. The actress had her cue. She snapped the magazine shut, her face melting into a flawless performance of concern and relief. "Frank! Oh, thank God!" She rose from the chair and rushed toward me, her arms outstretched. I stood my ground, forcing her to stop just short of an embrace. I was so worried. I was about to start calling the hospitals. When you didn't answer your phone, I thought the worst. Her voice was a perfect symphony of worried affection. Each note played with precision. It was sickening. "I'm fine," I said, my voice flat. "Sorry I'm late." "What happened? Was it traffic?" she asked, her perfectly shaped eyebrows knitting together in a pantomime of anxiety. This was it. This was my chance to see behind the curtain. I looked her directly in the eye, holding her gaze. Had a bit of car trouble on the way here, I said calmly. A minor fender bender, nothing serious, just took a while to sort out. I watched her process the words. A normal person, a loving daughter-in-law, would have responded with concern for my well-being. Are you okay? Were you hurt? But Chloe wasn't a normal person. Her mind was a high-speed calculator processing a catastrophic error in its equation. Fender bender? That's not possible. It was supposed to be a catastrophic brake failure. A wreck. He's not supposed to be here. The flicker of panic I'd seen a moment ago returned, a tiny tremor in her left eyelid. Her perfect smile tightened just a fraction of an inch. A fender bender? She repeated, her voice a little too sharp. Where? Where did it happen? Was anyone else involved? The questions were all wrong. They were the questions of an accomplice checking an alibi, not a concerned relative. She wasn't asking if I was okay. She was interrogating me, trying to figure out what had gone wrong with her plan. On the interstate, I lied smoothly. Truck in front of me slammed on its brakes. Luckily, the Mustang's brakes are in perfect working order. I let that last sentence hang in the air between us. Her eyes darted away from mine for a split second, a subconscious admission of guilt. She recovered quickly, forcing a shaky laugh. Oh, Frank, my goodness. Well, thank heavens you're all right. That's all that matters. She placed a hand on her chest, a gesture of theatrical relief. Leo would have been so worried. He'd want us to be strong for each other today, you know? This is all just so hard. She was using my son's memory as a shield, a tool to deflect and regain control of the narrative. The audacity of it, the sheer, cold-blooded hypocrisy, almost made me lose my composure. But I held on, fueled by the memory of his final desperate warning. It has no brakes. He had seen this, all of it. He had known the depths of the woman standing in front of me. Mrs. Jordan? Mr. Miller? A soft voice interrupted. A receptionist was standing by a large, frosted glass door. Mr. Reynolds will see you now. Chloe visibly straightened, her entire demeanor shifting. The brief moment of panic was gone, locked away. She was back in character, the grieving but composed widow, ready for the final act. She gave me a small, sad smile, as if we were allies in grief, and turned toward the conference room. Well, she said softly, let's get this over with. She walked ahead of me, her stride confident, her posture perfect. She believed she had weathered the unexpected storm. She thought she was walking toward a $40 million victory. I followed her, my steps steady and deliberate, knowing that I was walking into a courtroom and I was the prosecution's star witness. The conference room was even colder and more imposing than the reception area. A massive, polished mahogany table stretched the length of the room, surrounded by high-backed black leather chairs that felt more like thrones than seats. The same panoramic view of the city and the sound served as a backdrop, but from up here, the cars below looked like insignificant insects, and the people were invisible. It was a room designed to make you feel small, a place where fortunes were decided with the stroke of a pen. At the head of the table sat a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same expensive wood. This was Edward Reynolds, the senior partner. He was in his 70s, with a full head of silver hair, sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of reading glasses, and a calm, commanding presence that filled the room. He nodded gravely as we entered. Mr. Miller, Mrs. Jordan. Please, have a seat, he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. Chloe glided into the chair directly across from him, placing her designer handbag on the table with a soft, expensive thud. She arranged herself with the poise of a queen holding court. I took the seat to her right, feeling like a rough-hewn stone next to a polished diamond. The silence stretched as Mr. Pracian stoned. Reynolds methodically opened a thick, leather-bound folder. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. We are gathered today for the reading of the last will and testament of Leo Frank Miller, he began, his tone formal and detached. This document was prepared by our firm, properly executed, witnessed, and notarized on the 12th of June of last year. It is, to our knowledge, his final word on the distribution of his estate. He looked up at both of us. Shall I proceed? Chloe gave a single, solemn nod, the picture of graceful composure. I simply stared back at him, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Mr. Reynolds began to read. He started with a few minor bequests, a donation to the university Leo had attended, another to a local animal shelter. Then he came to the personal effects. To my father, Frank Miller, he read, I leave my collection of vintage watches and all of the tools and equipment in the garage workshop we shared. I also leave him, with all my love, our restored 1969 Ford Mustang, a symbol of the best hours of my life. A lump formed in my throat, hot and sharp. I looked down at the polished table, seeing my son's smiling face reflected in the dark wood. Then, Mr. Reynolds moved on to the main body of the estate. The properties, the stock portfolios, and Leo's controlling interest in his company, Innovate Financial. The total value, he stated calmly, was estimated to be just north of $40 million. I could feel Chloe straighten in her chair beside me. This was the moment she had been waiting for. This was the moment she had killed for. All the remaining assets, Mr. Reynolds continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room, including all properties, investments, and my entire stake in Innovate Financial, I bequeath in full to my beloved wife, Chloe Miller. And the words landed, and a profound, smug satisfaction settled over Chloe's features. It wasn't a broad grin, but a subtle, triumphant tightening at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes, when she dared to glance at me, were not filled with pity or shared grief, but with the cold, dismissive gleam of a victor. She had won. She had everything. In her mind, the game was over. I felt a surge of despair mixed with my anger. Was this it? Had Leo been too sick, too trusting, to protect himself? Was I now facing a long, brutal court battle against this monster, a fight I might not win? I looked at her triumphant face, and my resolve hardened into steel. If this was a fight she wanted, it was a fight she would get. Mr. Reynolds slowly finished reading the final clauses of the document. He then closed the leather-bound folder with a soft, definitive click. He took off his glasses and began to polish them with a silk handkerchief. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. Chloe shifted in her seat, preparing to offer some well-rehearsed words of humble gratitude. But Mr. Reynolds didn't give her the chance. He put his glasses back on, his sharp eyes looking first at her, then directly at me. However, he said, the single word cutting through the silence like a scalpel, that is not the final legally binding document pertaining to the estate. Chloe's triumphant smile froze on her face. I'm sorry, she stammered. What are you talking about? Mr. Reynolds reached inside the folder again and produced a second, much thinner envelope. I am referring to a legally executed codicil, he explained, his voice devoid of any emotion. An amendment to the will. It was brought to my office and signed by Leo Miller, in the presence of his physician and myself, 2 days before he passed away. The color drained from Chloe's face. She stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. A codicil? She whispered, her voice barely audible. That's not possible. He was delirious. He wasn't in his right mind. On the contrary, Mr. Reynolds stated calmly. His physician certified that he was lucid and of sound mind and memory. The codicil is legally unassailable. He carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper within. He cleared his throat. It is brief and to the point. It reads, I, Leo Frank Miller, do hereby revoke all previously stated provisions within my last will and testament concerning the distribution of my primary estate to my wife, Chloe Miller. I instead bequeath my entire estate, including all assets, properties, investments, and business holdings, without exception to my father, Frank Miller. The room tilted. Chloe made a small, choking sound. Mr. Reynolds wasn't finished. Leo included a final, personal sentence to be read aloud, he said, his eyes finding mine. I do this in recognition of his unwavering integrity and to ensure my life's work is placed in hands I trust completely. The $40 million meant nothing. The cars, the houses, the stocks, they all evaporated into mist. The only thing in the room was my son's final message. I trust you, Dad. It was a final, desperate reach across the void, an act of love and faith so profound that it took my breath away. A single, hot tear traced a path down my cheek. He had known, he had seen the truth, and in his final moments, he had protected me. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint, distant wail of a siren in the city below. Chloe sat perfectly still, frozen in her expensive leather chair, her face a blank porcelain mask. Her mind, so quick and calculating just moments before, had clearly short-circuited. She was staring at the single sheet of paper in Mr. Reynolds' hand as if she could set it on fire with her gaze alone. The $40 million, the penthouse apartments, the life of effortless luxury. It had all been a beautiful, shimmering mirage, and it was now evaporating before her very eyes. Her first word was a whisper, a sound of pure disbelief. Number. She shook her head slowly, a tiny jerky movement. No, that's not real. It's a mistake. She looked at Mr. Reynolds, her eyes pleading for him to take it back, to say it was all some horrible procedural error. Mr. Reynolds simply looked back at her over the rim of his glasses, his expression unchanging. The document is authentic, notarized, and legally binding, Mrs. Jordan. I assure you there is no mistake. And with that confirmation, the porcelain mask didn't just crack, it exploded. Chloe shot up from her chair with such violence that it scraped backward against the marble floor with a sound like a scream. You! She shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly thing I'd never heard before. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me. You did this. You were always whispering in his ear, poisoning him against me. He was sick. He was on medication. He didn't know what he was doing. You took advantage of a dying man. The accusation was so monstrous, so perfectly twisted, that all I could do was stare at her. She was accusing me of her own crime, painting me with her own brush. Before I could even process the words, she lunged. It wasn't a stumble or a reach. It was a feral, desperate leap across the corner of the massive table, her hands clawing for the codicil. Her perfectly composed facade was gone, replaced by a snarling, frantic animal trying to destroy the evidence of its defeat. Mr. Reynolds, for his part, moved with the unhurried grace of a man who had seen every form of human desperation. He simply drew the document back, holding it calmly against his chest, well out of her reach. Mrs. Jordan, I must insist you compose yourself, he said, his voice retaining its measured, professional tone, which only seemed to enrage her further. Compose myself? She screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria as she sagged against the table. He is trying to steal my life. I gave your son 3 years of my life. I took care of him. I sat by his bedside and held his hand while he withered away to nothing. I earned that inheritance. I deserve it. The sheer naked greed in her words was breathtaking. There was no mention of love, of loss, of the man she had married. There was only the transaction, the payment she felt she was owed for her time. The air in my lungs, which had been tight with grief and shock, suddenly felt clear. I looked at this screaming, contorted stranger and said, with a quiet deadliness that cut through her hysteria, yes, you certainly did take care of him. The double meaning sailed right over her head. She whirled back to the lawyer. This is illegal. I am his wife. The state of Washington protects spousal rights. I will contest this. I will bury you in litigation. I will take this to every court in the country. Mr. Reynolds had finally had enough. He remained seated, a pillar of calm in her hurricane of rage, and coolly pressed a button on the intercom on his desk. Susan, he said, his voice perfectly level, please send security to conference room A. Our meeting has concluded. The word security seemed to break the last thread of her sanity. She began grabbing at the original will, the thick legal document in the leather folder, tearing at the pages with her nails. I want the original. I want every copy. You can't do this to me. Just then, the conference room door opened, and 2 large, uniformed security guards stepped inside. They were professional, their faces impassive, but their presence instantly changed the dynamic of the room. They weren't there to negotiate. Chloe looked from the guards to me, her eyes blazing with a wild, cornered animal hatred. You think you've won? She hissed at me, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. This isn't over, you old man. I will fight this until you are bankrupt and in the ground. You will never see a penny of that money. Please escort Mrs. Jordan from the premises, Mr. Reynolds said to the guards. They moved toward her, and for a moment, I thought she might physically fight them. But as they each took an arm, her body went rigid, and she let out a final, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated fury. They guided her, stiff-legged and trembling with rage, toward the door. Her final words echoed down the marble hallway as they dragged her away. I'll destroy all of you. You hear me? I'll destroy you. The heavy door clicked shut, cutting off her voice. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the sound of a single sheet of paper fluttering from the table to the floor. Mr. Reynolds calmly leaned over, picked it up, and placed it back in the file. He straightened his tie. Well, he said with monumental understatement, I apologize for that outburst. It appears your son's foresight was considerable. The heavy conference room door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed back in was somehow louder and more jarring than Chloe's screams had been. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting stops, thick with the psychic residue of violence and rage. I sat staring at the spot where she had stood, my mind struggling to reconcile the elegant woman who had walked in with the shrieking feral creature who had just been dragged out. It was like watching a beautiful building collapse in on itself, revealing nothing but rot and ruin inside. My entire body felt heavy, anchored to the chair by the sheer weight of the last hour. Mr. Reynolds let out a long, slow breath. He methodically began to gather the papers Chloe had scattered, his calm movements a deliberate effort to restore order to the chaos she had left behind. He picked up the torn fragments of the original will and placed them neatly into a folder. "Frank," he said, his professional tone softening with a hint of genuine sympathy, "would you care for a glass of water?" I shook my head, unable to speak. He nodded in understanding. He then paused, his hand hovering over his briefcase. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "Leo's instructions to me were very specific. He left a second, sealed envelope. I was instructed to give it to you only after the will and any codicils had been read, and only on the condition that you were alone." He looked at me pointedly. "He anticipated that your daughter-in-law might not be present for the entirety of the proceedings." My head snapped up. Leo had planned for this. He had predicted her reaction. Mr. Reynolds reached into his briefcase and retrieved a simple, cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the vast, polished table. My name, Dad, was written on the front in Leo's familiar, slightly hurried script, my son's handwriting. The sight of it was a punch to the gut, more real and immediate than anything else that had happened today. My hand trembled as I reached for it. The paper felt warm, alive. It was the last thing my son would ever say to me. I broke the seal with my thumb and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The words were written, not typed. He had wanted me to see them as he'd formed them. As I read, his voice filled the silence in my head, as clear and real as if he were sitting right beside me. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and the worst has happened. I am so sorry. I'm sorry for the pain this will cause you, and I'm sorry I couldn't find a way to tell you this in person. I was a coward. I was sick, and I was scared. I know you never fully understood what I saw in Chloe, but you respected my choice, and I always loved you for that. For a while, things were good, but over the last year, something changed. She became desperate. I started noticing small financial discrepancies, things that didn't add up. So I did what I do best. I looked at the data. I ran a quiet forensic audit on our accounts. She was in debt, Dad. Over $300,000 in debt on credit cards and secret loans I never knew about. She was living a life even our money couldn't support, and she was terrified of me finding out. But that's not the worst of it. A few weeks ago, I was looking for a file on our shared home tablet. I saw the browser history. I wish to God I hadn't. She had been searching for weeks. Things like fast-acting, untraceable poisons, symptoms of arsenic poisoning, how to accelerate terminal illness, heavy metal compounds that mimic cancer. It all clicked into place. My sudden, aggressive illness. The doctors who couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. The way she insisted on preparing all my food and drinks herself, saying it was to make sure they were healthy. She wasn't caring for me, Dad. She was poisoning me. She was murdering me, slowly, right under our own roof. I wanted to go to the police, but I had no proof. Just a search history she could have easily denied. I was too weak to fight her. She would have told everyone I was delirious from the medication, paranoid. So I did the only thing I had the strength left to do. I protected my work. I protected you. Listen to me. Her ambition has no brakes. She won't stop with me. Now, she'll see you as the last obstacle between her and the money she feels she's owed for her crime. Please, Dad, be careful. She is more dangerous than you can possibly imagine. Don't let her get away with this. Use what I built to find the truth. Avenge me. I love you, Leo. I slowly folded the letter, my knuckles white, the paper crinkling under the pressure. The single tear that had escaped me earlier was gone, burned away by a fire that was now raging through my veins. The grief was still there, a great, hollow cavern in my chest, but it was now filled with a righteous fury so pure and so absolute it felt like a religious calling. My son hadn't died. He had been executed. The suspicion from the taxi ride was now a cold, hard, documented fact. I looked up from the letter, my eyes meeting Mr. Reynolds across the table. He saw the change in me. The grieving father was gone. The quiet, retired mechanic was gone. He was looking at something new, something harder. "This isn't about inheritance fraud anymore, Edward," I said, my voice low and brittle as steel. "This is about murder." Mr. Reynolds didn't flinch. He met my gaze, his expression transitioning instantly from sympathetic counsel to that of a seasoned legal strategist. The air in the room, thick with the aftermath of Chloe's rage, now crackled with a new, colder energy. "I agree," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial calm. "Her reaction, Leo's letter, this is far beyond a civil dispute. But we cannot, under any circumstances, take this to the police yet. Not like this." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "A grieving father's suspicions and a letter from a dead man are not enough. A prosecutor would see a bitter family feud over money. Chloe's lawyers would paint you as vengeful and unstable. We need an ironclad, undeniable case before we officially act. We need to forge the weapon before we go to war." He picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. "Marcus, it's Edward Reynolds. I have a situation that requires your immediate and utmost discretion. It's a delicate family matter that has just escalated into something much darker. I need your best work." He paused, listening. "Good. I'm sending the client to your office tomorrow morning. His name is Frank Miller. Listen to his story and give him whatever he needs." He hung up and looked at me. "Marcus Thorne, the best private investigator in the state. Former lead detective in the Seattle PD's Financial Crimes Unit. He's relentless. He'll find the truth." The days that followed were a blur of methodical, focused activity. My grief, which had been a paralyzing fog, had now crystallized into fuel. My garage, once a sanctuary of memory and loss, transformed into a command center, a war room. I cleared one of the long workbenches and set up a large whiteboard. In the center, I pinned a photograph of Chloe, smiling at her wedding. Around it, the web began to grow. Marco's high-resolution photos of the scored brake lines and the GPS tracker went up first. Then, a timeline of Leo's illness. The garage, a place where Leo and I had built things, was now the place where I would deconstruct his wife's life. Marcus Thorne was a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite, with eyes that missed nothing. 3 days after our first meeting, he came to the garage and laid a thin folder on my workbench. "Your son was right," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Chloe Miller's finances are a house of cards in a hurricane." He showed me the statements. Credit cards maxed out to the tune of $200,000. Another $150,000 in high-interest personal loans. A paper trail of extravagant spending, designer clothes, 5-star hotel stays, jewelry all meticulously hidden from their joint accounts. She was drowning in debt, Frank. The inheritance wasn't just a windfall for her. It was a life raft. He then handed me a second printout. "And this is from the cloud backup of the tablet your son mentioned." It was a list of her browser search history. The clinical, evil words seemed to mock me from the page. Thallium poisoning symptoms. Odorless, tasteless poisons for humans. How long for arsenic to be undetectable in autopsy? The next piece came from Dave. He had handed over the footage from his high-definition security system without a second thought. We sat in his study, watching the grainy, night vision footage on his computer monitor. But it was undeniably her. There was her white SUV parking 2 houses down, the headlights cutting out to plunge the street into darkness. There was her slim figure, moving quickly and deliberately toward my driveway. And there, under the stark infrared light, was the unmistakable glint of a tool in her hand as she raised the hood of my Mustang. It was a silent, damning movie of my own attempted murder. The final, most crucial piece of the puzzle came a week later. On Mr. Reynolds' advice, I had authorized a private medical examiner, a renowned toxicologist named Dr. Alistair Finch, to review Leo's hospital records and the tissue samples that had been preserved. Dr. Finch met me in Mr. Reynolds' office, his face grim. He laid out several complex lab reports on the conference table. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "the cellular degradation in your son's liver and nervous system is not consistent with the cancer he was diagnosed with. The patterns of decay, the specific mitochondrial damage, it's textbook, I'm afraid." He tapped one of the reports. We ran a full heavy metals panel. The lab found elevated, and I mean highly elevated, levels of thallium in his tissue. It was administered in small, cumulative doses over a period of several weeks. It would have mimicked a rapid, aggressive cancer perfectly. There is no medical doubt, in my opinion. Your son was poisoned. That night, I stood alone in my garage, the single overhead light illuminating the whiteboard. It was a constellation of pure evil. The motive: over $300,000 in secret debt. The means: thallium for my son, a meticulously sabotaged car for me. The opportunity: a loving caregiver, a trusted daughter-in-law. I held Leo's letter in one hand and Dr. Finch's toxicology report in the other. It was all there. An ironclad, undeniable case. The weapon was forged. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. "Edward," I said, my voice steady and cold as the steel of the Mustang's frame. "We have her. It's time." Hell. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the sky weeping over a city that felt indifferent to my war. Edward had worked through the night. By 9 a.m., a legal courier arrived at my door with a thick, heavy manila envelope. Inside was the culmination of our work: the official court summons for the civil suit against Chloe for inheritance fraud, and, more importantly, the formal notice of our comprehensive evidence submission to the King County District Attorney's Office, requesting a criminal investigation into the murder of Leo Miller and the attempted murder of myself. The courier asked if he should proceed with serving the papers. I took the envelope from his hands. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I'll handle this one myself." I didn't take the Mustang. It was still in my garage, shrouded in a car cover, a piece of evidence waiting for its day in court. Instead, I took my old pickup truck, the one I'd had for 20 years. It was dented, the paint was faded, but it was reliable and honest, and it felt right. The drive took me from my world into hers. I left behind the quiet streets of my neighborhood, with its modest, well-kept homes and old-growth trees, and merged onto the highway. 20 minutes later, I was exiting into the manicured perfection of the suburbs where Leo had bought his home. The houses here weren't homes, they were statements. Immense, architecturally modern structures of glass and white stone, sitting on pristine emerald lawns with not a single blade of grass out of place. It was a world of profound, sterile emptiness. Her house was the largest on the block, a gaudy, oversized mansion that looked more like a regional bank headquarters than a place where a family lived. It was all sharp angles and blindingly white stucco, a monument to the life she had been so desperate to secure. I parked my old weathered truck at the curb, a stark contrast to the gleaming luxury SUV in her driveway. I walked up the long, paver-stone walkway, the heavy envelope feeling like a slab of granite in my hand. This wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of finality, the personal delivery of a consequence she had forged with her own two hands. I rang the doorbell, and the long, melodic chime echoed from deep within the house. After a moment, the massive, dark wood door swung open. It was her. She was dressed in expensive silk loungewear, her hair tied back perfectly. She was trying to project an air of casual, wealthy indifference, but I could see the stress had taken its toll. She was thinner, and there were dark circles under her eyes that even her carefully applied makeup couldn't fully conceal. When she saw me standing on her doorstep, her face went through a rapid series of emotions. First shock, then a flash of fear, which was quickly replaced by a mask of pure, indignant rage. "What are you doing here?" she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Get off my property before I call the police." I didn't say a word. I simply held out the thick manila envelope. "This is for you." "I'm not taking anything from you," she hissed, crossing her arms. "Get out." "I think you'll want to see what's inside," I said, my voice cold and calm as a frozen lake. "It's a civil suit for inheritance fraud. It's also a notice that our lawyer, Mr. Reynolds, has formally submitted our findings to the district attorney's office. They'll be opening a criminal investigation." The color began to drain from her face, but the defiance in her eyes remained. "You have no findings, you have nothing." This was the moment, the final confrontation. I decided to give her everything, to let her see the full, inescapable weight of the anvil about to fall on her. "They might be interested in your tablet's browser history, Chloe," I began, my voice even and methodical. "The part where you spent a week researching the symptoms of thallium poisoning." Her jaw went slack. "And they'll certainly be interested in your finances. The $342,000 in secret debt you were hiding from my son." Her hands, which had been crossed defiantly, fell to her sides. And then there's the security footage from my neighbor, Dave. It's in perfect, high definition. It shows you, clear as day, sneaking into my driveway at midnight with a tool in your hand. She took a shaky step backward, her eyes wide with dawning horror. A certified automotive expert, Marco, is prepared to testify to a jury exactly how the precise scores on my brake lines are designed to cause a fatal wreck on a highway. She was visibly trembling now, clutching the doorframe for support. And finally, I said, delivering the final killing blow, there is the report from Dr. Finch, a brilliant toxicologist who found the poison in my son's body, the poison that you put there. And her defiance completely shattered, replaced by a raw, primal terror. The reality of her situation, the police, a trial, prison, crashed down upon her. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no sounds came out. Her carefully constructed world of lies and luxury had just been demolished in 30 seconds on her own doorstep. With a hand that shook violently, she reached out and took the envelope. I looked at her one last time, this hollowed-out shell of a woman. Leo saw who you were, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. In the end, he knew. He wrote it all down. This isn't from me, Chloe. This is from him. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back as I heard the massive door slam shut behind me, the sound of final, impotent roar of a monster caught in a trap. I got into my old truck, started the engine, and drove away, leaving her alone in that big, empty house, clutching the paper that contained her ruin. The vindication I felt wasn't joy. It was a cold, heavy, and necessary peace. The job was done. The wheels of justice, once they finally started to turn, moved with a surprising and relentless speed. 2 days after my personal delivery, Marcus Thorne called me. "Turn on the news," was all he said. I saw it live, a local news helicopter hovering over Chloe's neighborhood. On the ground, a quiet, orderly procession of unmarked police cars was parked in front of her stark white mansion. There were no sirens, no drawn-out standoff. They simply knocked on her door, presented a warrant, and escorted her out in handcuffs. She held a designer coat over her face to hide from the cameras, a final, pathetic attempt to control her image. The arrest of the Bellevue Black Widow, as the media quickly dubbed her, became the biggest story in the state. The trial, which began 6 months later, was a public spectacle. Every day, Chloe would arrive in a new, impeccably tailored outfit, her face a mask of somber innocence, flanked by a team of the most expensive defense lawyers in Seattle. Their strategy was clear: to paint me as a greedy, delusional old man, driven mad by grief, who had conspired to frame his blameless, loving daughter-in-law to steal an inheritance. They tried to tear apart my story, my character, and my sanity. But they had one major problem. They were fighting against the truth, and the truth had an army of witnesses. I watched as Dave, my neighbor, took the stand. In his simple, honest way, he told the jury exactly what he had seen that night. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't vengeful. He was just a good man who had seen something wrong and had the courage to speak up. I saw Marco, my mechanic, confidently explain to the jury, with the help of diagrams and the actual scored brake line, how the sabotage was a sophisticated, delayed-action death trap. He spoke with the clear, unshakable authority of an expert. I watched Marcus Thorne present the cold, hard facts of Chloe's secret life, the mountain of debt, the financial desperation, and the chilling, damning list of her internet searches for untraceable poisons. The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Finch, the toxicologist. He explained the science of thallium poisoning in a way everyone could understand, describing how it mimics the symptoms of other illnesses, how it slowly and cruelly shuts down the body's systems. He concluded by saying that the amount of thallium found in my son's body could not have been accidental. It was the result of systematic, intentional poisoning over several weeks. When it was my turn to take the stand, her lawyers tried to trip me up, to make me seem confused or angry. But I just stayed calm. I told my story. And when the prosecutor asked me about my son's final letter, I was allowed to read the last part of it to the court. I looked at the jury, then I looked directly at Chloe, and I read my son's final words. "Don't let her get away with this. Avenge me." A profound silence fell over the courtroom. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. The tension in the room was a physical thing as the foreman handed the verdict to the bailiff. Chloe sat ramrod straight, her mask of composure still in place, but I could see her hands trembling in her lap. The foreman cleared his throat and spoke, his voice ringing with finality. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant, Chloe Miller, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The mask shattered. A strangled sob escaped Chloe's lips as her lawyers slumped in their seats. The sentencing came a week later. The judge looked down at Chloe, her face a study in stern disappointment. "You were given a life of privilege and love," the judge said, her voice filled with quiet contempt. "And you twisted it into a weapon of greed and malice. You are a predator who cloaked herself in the guise of a loving wife. For your crimes, this court sentences you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." The sharp, definitive crack of the judge's gavel was the last sound I needed to hear. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, the sound of a debt being paid, the sound of justice. I walked out of the courthouse, not into sunlight, but into the familiar cleansing gray of a Seattle drizzle. I didn't feel joy, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound, quiet, and somber sense of closure. My son, my brilliant, loving son, could finally rest in peace. A year has passed since the day the gavel fell. The seasons have turned, and the relentless Seattle rain has washed the city clean many times over. The media frenzy has long since died down, and the name Chloe Miller has faded from the headlines into the quiet, permanent misery of a maximum security prison. I never kept the big house. I sold it, along with the luxury cars and all the expensive trappings of a life I never wanted. The $40 million that Chloe had coveted, the fortune she had killed for, felt like an anchor, and I was determined to turn it into a sale. I still live in my old house, but my garage is different now. The silence is gone. Most afternoons it's filled with the quiet clatter of tools, the murmur of questions being asked and answered, and the soft rock station playing on the old radio in the corner. The whiteboard where I once mapped out a murder investigation is now covered in engine diagrams and work schedules. I used the money from Leo's estate to create a foundation in his name. The Leo Miller Foundation doesn't fund galas or build shiny monuments. It funds futures. We provide scholarships and run a mentorship program right here, in this garage, for at-risk kids who are better with their hands than they are with textbooks. We teach them how to restore classic cars, how to weld, how to understand an engine. We teach them a trade, give them a skill, and show them that they have value. Right now, a 17-year-old named Jamal is carefully sanding down the fender of an old Chevy, his face a mask of intense concentration. Across from him, a quiet girl named Maria is learning how to rebuild a carburetor, her small hands surprisingly deft. They are good kids who just needed a place to belong, a place to build instead of break. I find myself smiling more than I have in years, watching them work, sharing the craft that my son and I once shared in this very space. The Mustang is still here, parked in the corner under a soft cover. It's no longer a crime scene, but a memorial. Sometimes the kids ask me about it, their eyes wide with reverence for the classic muscle car. I just smile and tell them, that one was special. That one was for my boy. I never wanted the money. I would have traded all of it 100 times over to have my son back, to have just one more afternoon with him here in the garage. But that was a deal the world was never going to offer. So I took the tragedy, the greed, and the ugliness, and I forged it into something new. I took the inheritance she tried to steal and turned it into a legacy he would have been proud of. Every time one of these kids finishes a project, every time I see the spark of pride in their eyes, I feel him here with me. Chloe's ambition may have had no brakes, but my son's love had no end. And in this noisy, grease-stained, beautiful garage, that love is still building things that are meant to last.